My wife had trouble getting pregnant, so we decided to try IVF. To my surprise, before the embryo synthesis, I caught my wife swapping my sperm with that of her first love. Later, when she thought she was giving birth to her and her old flame's child, ready to have him recognized as family, I laughed because I had already swapped the sperm back. I even replaced her egg with that of my ex-girlfriend's. After an overseas inspection of a medical cooperation project, my son Charles and I returned home to find a crowd of rarely seen distant relatives gathered at our house. It was such a scene that one might think we were having a family tree assembly. The most eye-catching among them was Ethan, sitting in the center of the sofa with red-rimmed eyes, while Victoria, my fun-loving wife who frequents bars and clubs, nestled against him, comforting him softly. I raised an eyebrow, placed my suitcase aside, and asked Victoria, "What special occasion is today that brings such a lively crowd?" Charles, following behind me, crossed his arms coldly and stared at Ethan with disdain, already sensing this man's identity. My mother-in-law sat in the main seat, looking displeased and hesitant to speak. Before Victoria could respond, Ethan walked towards Charles with tears in his eyes, exclaiming, "My dear son, I am your real father." Charles deftly stepped aside, his face filled with disgust, as if Ethan were some filthy thing. He stepped back and said coldly, "My father's name is Sincere." I held Charles's hand and gave him a reassuring look, then raised my fist and punched Ethan in the face. The dull thud of my fist echoed in the living room as I said coldly, "Don't claim kinship falsely." Victoria immediately stood up, tenderly helping Ethan up while shouting at me, "Sincere, have you gone mad? How dare you hit Ethan?" She raised her hand to slap me, but Charles quickly stepped forward and slapped her instead, saying through gritted teeth, "How dare you hit my dad?" Charles's voice was low but carried undeniable authority. Victoria stood in shock, both angry and upset, raising her hand again to hit Charles. Ethan, however, pulled her back, pretending to dissuade her. "Victoria, don't hit him, he's our son." His fake fatherly demeanor made me want to vomit. Victoria lowered her hand, glaring at Charles. "If not for your biological father's sake, I would have taught you a lesson today." Charles sneered. "Oh, I'd love to see what you can do." His sharp gaze was exactly like mine in my youth, and I felt a surge of pride. "My boy, raised well by me." An elder cleared his throat, trying to calm the chaotic scene. "Everyone quiet down." His authoritative voice gradually restored order, and all eyes turned to him. He looked at Victoria and asked, "Victoria, why have you called everyone here today?" Victoria took a deep breath as if summoning courage. She reached out to hold Ethan's arm affectionately and said, "Actually, today, I have an important announcement." She paused, looking around at everyone before finally fixing her gaze on me and Charles. I watched her calmly, curious to see what trick she would pull. She said, "Charles is not Sincere's biological son." Victoria's voice was low but like a bomb exploding in the living room. Charles turned to me in shock, and I signaled him to stay calm. The relatives around us whispered excitedly, like sharks smelling blood. She continued, "Years ago, when we did IVF, the doctor said Sincere's sperm was of poor quality. To spare his feelings, I swapped it with Ethan's." She cast a malicious glance at me, hoping to see me lose control, but I remained composed. Forced to continue her act, she said, "Today I've gathered everyone to witness Charles acknowledging his biological father." The room erupted with chatter, some saying, "If Charles isn't Sincere's son, he must acknowledge his real father. It's time for Sincere to step down from the Liu family's businesses." I inwardly sneered at these relatives who had been marginalized from the company's management and were eager to see me ousted. Charles tightened his grip on my hand. I said firmly, "Charles will always be my son." Ethan, looking helpless, sighed, "Sincere, how long will you deceive yourself? Charles is indeed my son." Over the years, watching Victoria treat Charles like a puppet, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. She thought she was tricking me, but little did she know she had been raising someone else's child for over 20 years. Victoria interrupted my thoughts with a sneer. "You're just being stubborn. Charles may have been with you all these years, but his biological father is Ethan." I replied calmly with a hint of provocation. You're dreaming. Victoria snorted. If you don't believe me, let's do a paternity test. I also want a divorce. I've had enough of being your lapdog for 25 years. I've been more than kind to you. When she mentioned divorce, a hint of joy flashed across her face. It seemed she had been thinking about it for a long time. She dared to say she had been kind to me. For 25 years, she and I had lived in separate rooms. While I raised our child alone, she was off gallivanting with Ethan. While I fought in the business world to uphold the Liu family's name, she was partying with a bunch of rich kids. But she was wrong about one thing. I didn't marry her out of love. I married her to gain the status of the Liu family's son-in-law and control over the Liu group. Now that the Liu group was firmly under my control, Victoria had no more use to me. I said, divorce is fine with me. I shrugged indifferently. But there's no need for a paternity test. I'm certain Charles is my son. Charles looked at me with determination. Dad, I believe you. Victoria and Ethan panicked. She said, Charles, don't you believe your mother? Charles ignored her and stayed close to me. At that moment, a boy who looked like a college student burst in. He walked straight to Charles, excitedly calling out, Brother! Everyone was stunned. It was one thing to have another father pop up, but now there was another brother. Looking at the boy who resembled Ethan, I had a hunch. This must be Victoria and Ethan's illegitimate child. They had hidden it well. No wonder Victoria's frequent absences and her pregnancy had gone unnoticed. My mother-in-law, sitting at the head of the table, asked, Victoria, what's going on? The atmosphere in the living room froze again. The boy with red-rimmed eyes looked like he was about to cry. Brother, my name is Gabriel. I've always known about you. He stammered, his voice trembling. He glanced at me fearfully, then quickly lowered his head as if afraid I would scold him. My dad often talks about you, saying how excellent and handsome you are. Ethan put on a pained expression. Charles, my dear son, I've missed you so much all these years. He looked up, his face full of sorrow, as if he had suffered a great injustice. Gabriel has always wanted to meet you. We've often secretly watched you. Gabriel nodded eagerly, adding, Really, brother, I even went to your school just to be closer to you. He took out a stack of photos from his pocket and handed them to Charles, saying, These are your photos. I took them secretly. Charles flipped through the photos, seeing himself in various moments, wearing a graduation gown, looking tired after basketball practice, and passionately debating with classmates. He felt a chill run down his spine, realizing there had been a creepy guy stalking and photographing him all these years. Victoria wasn't idle either. She walked over to my mother-in-law, pointing at Gabriel, and said solemnly, Mom, this is your grandson. Everyone is here to witness this. Please acknowledge him. Victoria was clever. She knew that after my father-in-law's death, my mother-in-law held the real power in the Liu family. By inviting all the relatives, she hoped to pressure my mother-in-law into accepting Gabriel. She was certain that if my mother-in-law agreed, I would have no choice but to comply. After all, she had observed my filial piety towards my mother-in-law over the past 25 years. Gabriel, quick-witted, immediately turned to my mother-in-law and respectfully called out, Grandma? My mother-in-law looked at Gabriel, then at me, her eyes filled with complex emotions. She didn't immediately respond to Gabriel's greeting. I knew she felt sorry for me. Not wanting to make things difficult for her, I broke the silence. Victoria, your real intention is to have this illegitimate child recognized as a Liu family member and inherit the Liu family's assets, right? Why involve Charles? I turned to Charles, exchanging a glance. Even if Charles isn't my biological son, he is still my only child. All my assets, properties, stocks, funds, including 20% of the Liu Group's shares, will be left to him. Charles, would you rather stay with me or go with your mom and this so-called father? My son's quick mind grasped my meaning instantly. He declared, Mom has a new son now, and the assets won't be left to me. Of course I'll stay with Dad. Good boy, well taught by me, stating his purpose in reverse. Ethan's eyes lit up at the mention of all my assets going to Charles, shining brighter than a 1,000-watt bulb. He knew my assets were substantial, including a significant amount of gold, silver, and real estate, not to mention the 20% Liu Group shares, a veritable gold mine. Greed, naked greed, was written all over his face. He whispered to Victoria, when the old man passed away, he divided his 60% of the group's shares into 4 parts. 20% to Sincere, 20% to the old lady, 10% to Charles, and you only got 10%. If Sincere transfers his shares to Charles, and we later coax Charles into giving us his shares, you'll have 40%. Right now, we need to make Sincere give up his shares and assets, leaving him with nothing, and bring Charles to our side. Victoria, after some thought, agreed with Ethan and presented herself as a loving mother to Charles. She said, "Charles, your brother can fend for himself and won't fight you for the assets. I'm willing to give you everything." She paused, adding a condition. "But you must go with Ethan for a paternity test. If it shows that you two are father and son, you have to acknowledge Ethan as your dad and treat him well." Charles glanced at me, and I gave a barely noticeable nod. "Okay." Charles agreed readily but cleverly added a condition. "Before we do the paternity test, both of you need to come with me to the notary office and transfer all assets to my name unconditionally." I silently applauded my son's shrewdness. He understood that only assets in hand were real, not mere verbal promises. This got the greedy relatives excited. If Ethan could think of it, so could they. They rubbed their hands as if they saw countless treasures beckoning to them. Victoria didn't understand business. If the Liu Group were under her name, it would be easy for them to manipulate her. One of the relatives led the cheers. "Good, good, good, that's the way to do it." Another relative took out his phone, dialing as he said, "I'll contact the notary office right away." A group of people busied themselves as if preparing for a celebration. My mother-in-law, concerned, tried to stop me. "Good child, reconsider the asset transfer." I smiled and shook my head, reassuring her, "Mom, don't worry, I have my reasons." Knowing my capabilities, she didn't try to persuade me further. With their help, all assets under Victoria's and my name were transferred to Charles, except for a living allowance of $50,000 each. In the notary office, Victoria and Ethan looked lovingly at Charles, envisioning a future where he led the Liu Group to greatness, their smiles bright. As they dreamed during the notarization process, I added, "Ethan, don't you claim to love Charles? Shouldn't you show it?" I casually suggested, eyeing Ethan's hypocritical face. "I've spent millions raising your son these past 20+ years. I'm not asking for compensation. Just give the money to Charles. After all, I love him the most." Charles seized the opportunity. "Uncle Ethan, you've been with my mom for over 20 years. You must have saved millions, right? Since we're at the notary, why not show your sincerity? Otherwise, I'll doubt your love for me and think you just want the Liu family's assets." Ethan's face stiffened, caught in a dilemma. He'd feel pain giving up the money, but refusing would cast doubt on his motives. Reluctantly, he pulled out a card and handed it to Charles, saying, "Charles, of course Dad loves you. Here's $5 million I've saved over the years." Charles didn't hesitate to grasp the card and called in the notary personnel for immediate notarization. Ethan smiled stiffly, like he was being skinned alive. The DNA testing center was Victoria's choice, fearing I'd manipulate the results. She chose the most authoritative National Forensic Center. I smirked at her naivety. After samples were taken from me, Ethan, and Charles, I requested a sample from Victoria too. Victoria looked at me incredulously. "Sincere, are you crazy? Charles is undoubtedly my child." I smirked. "We're already here. Might as well do it." Charles didn't understand my motive but trusted I had a reason. He pouted and demanded Victoria do the test too. Now treating Charles like a deity, she complied. As we left the center, Gabriel arrived late, carrying flowers. "Brother," he called to Charles, trying to hug him. Charles, disgusted, pushed him away. "Don't touch me, it's gross." Gabriel, taller than Charles by half a head, looked decent. Ethan tried to smooth things over. "Charles, he's your brother. A family should love each other." Charles rolled his eyes. "Wait for the results before claiming kinship." I added calmly, "I won't interrupt your family bonding, Victoria. Let's go get the divorce papers." With no assets and no child custody to negotiate, Victoria and I didn't even need a divorce agreement. We went straight to the Civil Affairs Bureau for the divorce certificates. Ethan's eyes widened in joy, shocked by the swift divorce process. He expected me to cling on stubbornly, but seeing Charles firmly by my side made him envious. After Charles went to the parking lot to get the car, Ethan finally had a chance to mock me. "Sincere, Victoria never loved you. Do you know why Charles is named Charles? Because my name has an E in it," symbolizing Ethan. Victoria, clinging to Ethan, smugly said, "When the paternity test results come out, Charles will naturally come back to us." Gabriel, dropping his innocent act, arrogantly said, "All the money is Charles's now. When the results confirm the truth, you'll be left homeless." I didn't bother responding to their foolish provocations. Victoria, feeling confident, revealed her true intentions. "You've controlled the Lou group for so long. Now it's time for Ethan and me to take charge." I laughed coldly. "You were always after the Lou group's assets using Charles." Victoria snorted. "So what if I am? Now that the assets are all transferred to Charles, once the paternity test results are out, I'll be the true master of the Lou group." I replied with a cold gaze. "Then let's see if you're really that lucky to take control of the Lou group." Their schemes were as noisy as firecrackers, thinking they had everything under control, but they didn't realize they had no chance from the start. While I was handing over the company affairs, Gabriel showed up, kicked the general manager out, and brazenly sat in the leather chair with his legs crossed, claiming he was the general manager because his brother was the chairman. No one dared to stop him, but I did. I said, "Throw him out." Security guards immediately stepped forward to lift Gabriel. He shouted, "How dare you touch me? My brother is the chairman. I'm his biological brother. You dogs, try touching me." He even cursed at me. "You bastard. You've been kicked out of the Lou family and have no right to command the Lou group's employees." He pushed and shoved the security guards trying to hit me. Outrageous. Just as I was about to teach him a lesson, Charles arrived, asking coldly, "What's going on?" Gabriel immediately put on a pitiful expression. "Brother, you're here just in time. This bastard wants the security to kick me out." Charles looked at him coldly. "This is a company, not a place for you to cause trouble. And I'm not your brother." A voice chimed in. "Charles, how can you speak to your brother like that?" Ethan arrived too. "Your family. You need your brother to help you with company matters. Without family support, you'll be bullied." Charles sneered. "Throw them both out." Seeing that the soft approach didn't work, Ethan tried to be forceful. "I'm Victoria's husband, Charles's biological father. This group belongs to me too." I laughed coldly. "Throw them out and don't dirty the company." The security guards, finally understanding who was in charge, lifted the clueless pair and dragged them out. Ethan, still shouting, "Sincere, wait for the paternity test results. I'll make you beg me for a meal." I watched his pathetic state and said, "Don't worry, I'm eagerly waiting for the results." The long-awaited day for Ethan finally arrived. I got up early, donned a full suit, ready to watch Ethan's downfall from a high place. Except for my mother-in-law. Victoria had invited all the relatives to the forensics center to witness the results, probably hoping more people would see me as a joke. Before the results were revealed, I asked Victoria with a smirk, "This is the forensics center you chose. You won't dispute the results, right?" Victoria, with her head held high, confidently said, "Of course not. I always keep my word." I almost laughed out loud. So naive she wouldn't believe it until she saw it. As the technician arrived with the results, Ethan began his performance. He affectionately put his arm around Victoria's shoulders, saying solemnly, "Victoria, once the results are out, our family can finally reunite." He even glanced at me provocatively. I ignored him, turning to Charles, who also looked indifferent. Ethan, hitting a wall, adjusted his expression and turned to Charles. "From now on, I'm your father. If you need anything, just tell Dad." He took out a small box and handed it to Charles. "This is a watch I bought for you, a gift for recognizing me. Do you like it?" Charles, without even looking at it, coldly replied, "No need." Ethan's smile froze, and Victoria quickly tried to smooth things over. "Charles, your father means well." Charles interrupted. "I don't need his goodwill. I only have one father, and that's Sincere." A warm feeling surged in my heart. My son, always on my side. Just then, the technician returned with 3 DNA test results. Ethan, Victoria, and Gabriel immediately perked up, their eyes glued to the documents like hungry wolves. They looked at me triumphantly, as if I would be disgraced the next moment, and they would enjoy wealth and honor. I could hardly contain my laughter. The technician opened the envelope, and Ethan's breath quickened. Victoria's hands trembled with excitement, her face flushed. She muttered, "Charles, we can finally be together as a family." She glanced at me with an expression that seemed to say I was already defeated. Ethan's body trembled with excitement. Charles, Dad finally proved himself. Foolish Gabriel eagerly approached Charles. "Brother, once we get back to the Lou Group, make me the general manager. I'm your real brother. Only I can sincerely help you." He acted as if Charles's help was a given, as if the general manager position was already his. I watched their pathetic performance with a cold sneer. They wouldn't know who the real fool was until the last moment. The technician cleared his throat and began to read the results. According to the DNA comparison, Mr. Ethan and Mr. Charles, he deliberately paused, making Ethan and Victoria even more nervous, stretching their necks as if they could hear better. The surrounding relatives held their breath. Their expressions varied, waiting to see my downfall. The technician continued, "Are not biologically related." The air seemed to freeze. Victoria's eyes widened and she screamed hysterically, "Impossible! There must be a mistake." Ethan, equally shocked, asked, "How can this be? How is there no biological relationship?" Ethan's face turned pale and he couldn't hide the terror in his expression. Gabriel snatched the report, saying, "You must have misread it. Let me see." After reading it, he collapsed into a chair, muttering, "How can this be?" I asked the technician to read out the paternity test between me and Charles. He read, "According to the DNA comparison, Sincere and Charles are biological father and son." The room erupted in disbelief. Victoria, struck as if by lightning, muttered, "Impossible." Seeing the confusion on my mother-in-law's face and others, I kindly explained, "When you tried to swap the samples, I saw it, so I swapped my sperm back." Watching her face turn increasingly pale, I continued, "Oh, and I also swapped your egg with that of my ex-girlfriend's." The room fell silent in shock. My mother-in-law looked up, her eyes filled with disbelief. I turned to Victoria and said, "Charles is not your child. Congratulations on being a mother to my son for over 20 years. Victoria grabbed the paternity report from the technician and, seeing the result, her eyes turned blood red. She lunged at me, shouting, "You scum!" But I caught her and pushed her to the ground, looking down at her coldly. Ethan, upon hearing this, clung to Victoria, his voice hoarse. "Victoria, if Charles isn't yours, then he isn't a Lou. The only heir can be Gabriel." His face lit up with hope as he clung to Victoria's hand. Realizing what had happened, Victoria looked up, a hint of malice in her eyes. She stumbled to her feet, turned to my mother-in-law and said, "Mom, everyone heard and saw that Charles isn't my child." She pointed at me, spitting angrily. "He's the bastard child of Sincere and his ex-girlfriend. We can't let an outsider inherit the Lou family's assets." Ethan and Gabriel echoed her, "Yes, throw Charles out. The heir must be Gabriel." My mother-in-law, recovering from shock, looked at me with complex emotions. She trembled slightly and asked, "Sincere, is it true?" Seeing her like this, I felt a pang of sadness. "It's true," I confirmed. Victoria, dissatisfied with my mother-in-law's reaction, shook her hand. "Mom, you have to announce Gabriel as the heir." My mother-in-law, regaining her composure, asked calmly, "Do you know who Sincere's ex-girlfriend is?" Victoria, desperate, retorted, "Who cares? Charles isn't our child." My mother-in-law said, "Sincere's ex-girlfriend is your sister, Serafina. She's my biological daughter, so Charles is still a Lou and the rightful heir." Her words exploded like a bomb in the crowd. Our family tradition dictates the legitimate eldest child inherits the business. Nowadays, it's about the legitimate child of the original wife. Only if there are no direct descendants